I'm here from Genscape, Wood Mackenzie. My name is Collette Breshears. I'd like to cover sort of a midstream update for the Utica and Marcellus, specifically on the natural gas side. As Joe said, I've been covering infrastructure in the Northeast for the last several years. I really kind of came into the industry in 2014, which is right around the time that we started to see critical infrastructure constraints appear in the Northeast US, and really kind of made it my job to know what was going on all aspects of the infrastructure, and to try to predict impacts and construction timing of these pipelines. Coming into this industry as an outsider, and kind of learning through the experience of watching these pipelines build out has been quite an honor, because it's incredibly complex, the logistics needed to get even a single short pipeline into the ground. So I'm happy to be here, although virtually, to give this presentation. It'll look a little bit different than in previous years. I'm going to address this here in a couple of slides, but just kind of wanted to give a quick agenda. Basically, I plan to go through essentially the same presentation if you've been to this or a similar conference before, giving kind of a background, how we got to where we are, why infrastructure became critically important in the Northeast, and then looking at our current major Appalachian projects, both those that have happened earlier this year in 2020 and what we're expecting looking forward into 2021. And then really, like, what are we looking at forward from there, both on the production infrastructure side and what additional challenges we have to overcome. If you have been to a conference before and recognize this layout for the presentation, it's essentially the same slides as you've seen before, but now it's a little bit different color and different format. And that's because Genscape is now Wood Mackenzie. Genscape was founded in the late aughts, I suppose, and focused on real-time and short-term forecasting for energy commodities, the power, natural gas, and oil. And then late last year, Genscape was acquired by Wood Mackenzie, which also does forecasting, but Wood Mackenzie focuses more on the long-range type of forecast. So currently, for example, the Wood Mackenzie natural gas forecast runs from 2020 out to 2040. And later this year, I think they're going to update it to run out to 2045, in quite a big contrast to, say, like my forecasts, which maybe go out to 2023. So it's been a very great change. It's phenomenal to kind of dig into what makes a long-term model tick. And I've been quite excited to meet my Wood Mackenzie colleagues. Wood Mac also covers quite a few extra verticals as well. Instead of just energy commodities, Wood Mackenzie is really focused on natural resources of all kinds. So if you're looking at a metals vertical or industry, chemicals, sand, really if it's extracted from the earth in some shape or form and traded around the world, Wood Mackenzie is there to provide stats, everything from sort of very granular forecasts on the upstream side to a very macro look at maybe global economics, and trying to predict where the world will be in 20 years. And then that really is a part of what informs the Verisk, I guess, like over company as well. Verisk owns Wood Mackenzie as well as a host of other businesses. And Verisk comes from two words, veritas, which is Latin for truth, and risk, which is risk. Verisk is kind of approaching this from the insurance industry, and grew out of the idea that insurance industry and companies need to be making data-driven decisions. And Verisk has done that both internally and through acquiring a huge range of other companies, such as Wood Mackenzie. There's one that is Geomni that does aerial imagery, and then one that has gotten quite a lot of attention this year called AIR, which does, among other things, pandemic modeling. So that's been an interesting lens to kind of live through in 2020. But it all kind of comes back together. It is Genscape's information, it's our same models, our same people. We're just now known as Wood Mackenzie. A little bit about me. If you haven't seen me speak before or met me before, my name is Collette Breshears. Like I said, I've been doing infrastructure since about 2014 at this point. I lead a team of 3 or 4 people, and we track all natural gas and NGL, natural gas liquids, related projects across the United States and Canada. Right now, we are heavily focused in the Permian Basin rather than in the Northeast. And that's really just because the Permian Basin is a little bit harder to track since it's all intra-Texas. And we're doing flights over the Permian Highway and Whistler pipelines to follow their construction and help predict in-service dates. Whereas in the Northeast, we focused very heavily here for several years, following projects like Rover and Atlantic Sunrise, Mountaineer Express, kind of cut our teeth on the Northeast projects and are now applying that knowledge into the Permian Basin. I have a master's degree in earth science, focused on structural geology. Really happy to talk rocks with anybody, because I don't get to do quite a lot of that portion of my academic focus anymore. But that's a little side to today's presentation. So feel free to get in touch with me, send me an email. You will get a copy of these slides. Or if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out via email. I should be available pretty quickly all day today. To jump into the presentation itself, the background and current status of where we are at. In the last decade, and I always like to start by looking at the last 10 years because it has been a phenomenal change. The difference between 2009 and 2010 and today is incredible in terms of technology, in terms of what people are using, like at their houses, how jobs are being performed, both sort of using the internet, using Zoom presentations, and really through sort of the energy supply that the country uses to operate. In 2009 and 2010, we were in the very, very early years of what we call the shale revolution. Most of the wells being drilled and producing prior to 2008 and 2009 were our classic conventional vertical wells, tapping into our conventional oil and natural gas basins, which occur, as you can kind of see highlighted in green, in Texas, along the Gulf Coast, Gulf of Mexico, and then stretching up through Oklahoma and the mid-continent into the Rockies. So when we are talking about the natural gas supply in particular, we were really dependent on gas being produced in the Rockies and in sort of this Texas Gulf Coast area. The gas was produced here in the central US, and then it was transported over to the west where there's demand, and majoritively transported up into the Northeast area. This is where a huge portion of the population of the US resides, in the Northeast and along the seaboard here. And that is also where we see a huge amount of natural gas demand, both for industrial, residential, and commercial reasons, and power generation too. What we see when we switch from 2009 to 2010 into 2019, 2020, is we see these supply basins radically shift. We still have sort of our mainstay, the Rockies and the Mid-Continent are producing, but we actually see the relative percentage of gas coming out of our traditional basins, South Texas, East Texas, Gulf of Mexico. These are now down into the single digits in terms of their sort of contribution to the overall production stack. And instead we see the Permian, which has come up quite a lot in recent years. And then we see a huge growth in the Northeast. And this is all due to the horizontal well drilling and the ability to tap into the shale reserves in the Marcellus and the Utica. This is an incredible growth because not only has the East, if we flip back here, the East here was 5% of a daily wet gas production, this wet gas including our natural gas liquids. The East was producing 5% of 62 BCF per day. In 2019 and 2020, the East is producing 32% of 106 BCF a day. That's an incredible amount of gas and an incredible amount of growth for this region. If we look at the differences in BCF, that's almost 31 BCF per day of production that we have seen come out of the Northeast in the last 10 years. And that's a daily value, 31 BCF per day. And this is a huge amount of gas. It has changed the way that gas flows across the US. No longer are we making gas sort of in this mid-continent, Texas region and flowing it to the Northeast. Instead, the East has pushed gas into this mid-continent area. It's pushing back on Rockies gas. It's pushing back on mid-continent Gulf Coast gas. And it's taken over a huge portion of supply to this eastern seaboard. And every year as infrastructure projects are created or are finished and allow this gas to penetrate further, northeastern production moves further across the US. And this has been a big game changer for a lot of the exploration and production companies in the Northeast. It hasn't been smooth sailing for them. And part of that is because of this structural change needed on the side of infrastructure in order to allow this huge amount of growth. So if you've seen my presentation before, this is a familiar chart. This is my favorite way to look at northeastern production. And essentially, there's several different layers here. So we're looking at pipelines in terms of their ideal capacity. And then we're looking at the projects that have been completed that allow extra capacity on these pipelines. And there's three ways that you can categorize this capacity. You can be regional, where you're moving gas around sort of inside the production basin, or you're increasing connectivity from one pipe to another pipe, but you're not really getting that gas out of the region to somewhere where it's being consumed or where it's displacing the Rockies gas or where it's displacing Canadian gas or Gulf gas. And then in contrast, you do have those projects that allow that export capacity on those pipelines. And this would be projects like Leach Express, Rover, Nexus, Atlantic Sunrise. Early on in the Northeast, we had this Rockies Express reversal, where we actually took a portion of a pipeline meant to take gas from the Rockies over to the Northeast, and we reversed it. So now it's taking Northeast gas over to Indiana and Illinois, which is it was a huge deal at the time because this production in the Northeast had nowhere to go. And then on top of that, we also add an extra category to these projects where we're also looking at demand projects. And these demand projects are projects within the producing region that allow gas to be taken off of those export-capable pipelines and consumed. So this would be projects like power plants, expansions of local distribution systems, industrial use, projects that are sort of allowing more gas to flow from maybe these interstate export-capable pipelines into sort of the more regional distribution systems. Here, TICO is shorthand for the Columbia Gulf system, or the Columbia Gas System. And this system really is like a huge local distribution system in the Northeast. And TICO has had a lot of infrastructure go in over the years that has boosted its capacity to move gas around. We do count that as sort of regional movement and not necessarily as demand. But these demand projects allow gas to be taken off of those export pipelines and for new production to then kind of fill in. And this was incredibly important, especially in sort of the early parts of this infrastructure build out in 2016 and 2017, when production was heavily constrained by infrastructure available, especially for those export path corridors. Because that was really what was allowing these E&P companies to continue to drill, to continue to produce, and they were running into the problem where they could drill a well and they could bring it online and nobody really knew what those wells were capable of because there was so much pressure on these systems and such a degree of new production sort of competing for this space that they could only allow these wells to operate at a pretty low level. So it took years before we were able to kind of solve that problem. But infrastructure did catch up to sort of this growth of production in early 2018. We started to see with Leach Express coming online, and then with additional phases of Rover, Atlantic Sunrise, and Nexus, we sort of saw infrastructure start to take the lead here, and we saw a gap develop in late 2019 or 2018, early 2019, between this production and infrastructure. And this has been welcome for most of the producers in the Northeast. They were feeling some other pressures, mostly economic at that point. Not really evident in this production curve is sort of the boom and bust cycle of oil and natural gas prices sort of throughout this time. But we did see a lot of operators in 2019, and especially now in 2020, talk about paying back debt, talking about sort of guiding to lower production levels. They're no longer kind of setting their sights on the stars. They're reining it in a little bit and making sure that they're cash flow positive. And that has meant that we haven't seen production quite grow as explosively into this predicted infrastructure space. But we did see it recover and peak in November 2019. And this is a little bit of a different number than the numbers elsewhere in the presentation, because this is just dry gas. This is gas that can get onto pipelines. So it's 33 BCF a day for a dry gas production peak in the Northeast. And this is a huge amount because we were, if this is a 16 BCF a day growth here, this line, over where we were even in just mid-2014. So that's not very much time at all, and that's a tremendous growth. And what we've seen since then, we saw producers kind of back off a little bit. We saw low prices continue to kind of push into the natural gas sphere. There's been a lot of competition coming out of the Permian Basin as pipelines there have come online to allow the oil production associated gas access to significant demand markets, specifically in the Gulf, which has a lot of LNG demand being built out, but it is also being supplied quite well by the very low-cost Permian gas. And as we saw earlier this year, Permian gas can and will trade negative because the profit associated with that is all on the oil side, and the gas is sort of a byproduct. If you can get a good return for it, it's worth it, but as long as you're not taking too big of a hit on it, then it's worth it to take it to market. So that was kind of the story heading into early 2020. And then with the impact of coronavirus, we saw a change in demand. Again, we saw sort of falling market prices, and we saw production kind of rein in a little bit. We actually saw, with the huge drop in demand, we actually saw several producers in the Northeast, such as EQT, choose to shut in their production and essentially wait for sunnier weather, as it were. The other thing to kind of keep in mind when looking at production forecasts and production totals historically is that it takes about 6 months or so for production to respond to price signals. It's not an immediate thing. You can see some immediate changes, such as when EQT chooses to shut in or bring that production back. We know that there are other operators in the area like Cabot that will do the same thing. But that's a small portion of what is being produced on a daily level. And overall, when you're drilling new wells, like if we see prices go to like $5 for next year, it's going to take a little bit for those wells to be drilled and to come online in reaction to that price, as opposed to the current forward prices, which are closer to like the $250 range. Kind of getting back to the Northeast infrastructure, we've got some pipeline expansions that are still coming up. And if you look at this collection here, these are our demand and export pipes. You can see we have a little bit of an uptick here in our export pipes without kind of looking for demand. And that's our Buckeye Express pipeline. This helps to add Ohio takeaway. It essentially connects into where the Leach Express pipeline ended, sort of in mid-Ohio, takes gas out of that mid-Ohio area south to Leach, Kentucky, where it can hop on to Columbia Gulf and get down to that Gulf LNG. We have our big flagship project, which is Mountain Valley Pipeline, tentatively coming online, we think, in March next year. And that is a big tranche of takeaway capacity, 2 BCF a day. And then here you'll see that we have kind of no export, but we do have some demand style projects. And these are going to be your FM 100 project on National Fuel Gas and the Leidy South project on Transco. And we currently have these as demand style projects where they can remove some production from export capable pipelines. These may be reclassified as we continue to dig into them and look at pipeline flows a little bit closer to when these projects come online. Over here on the regional side, we have the Green Interconnect. This is a part of the Mountain Valley Pipeline that may allow part of it to come online earlier, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then we have our Penn East Phase 1 here at the end of 2021. And I'll dig into that here in a second as well. But overall, the story here, the takeaway is we have this production and we came very close to kind of hitting this export threshold here. And then we backed off a little bit through a combination of other market forces kind of keeping this production down. But it is relatively steady. Right here, and we're continuing to kind of build out slowly in the future. This infrastructure growth over the last several years has really targeted nearby demand markets, thinking about kind of back to those major projects and thinking about like MVP and where it is targeting, we see most of the gas headed west and then south through this sort of South Ohio corridor towards the Gulf, then to the South Atlantic, mostly through the Transcontinental Pipeline owned by Williams, and then lastly to the east and northeast in Canada. Canada hasn't really been through a lack of permission. It's really mostly due to a lack of need. Canada is very well supplied from the Michigan side of this border here, as well as sort of through the top portion of Canada over the Great Lakes. The east and northeast infrastructure has been running into a lot of issues, crossing through New York State and recently also through New Jersey. And that essentially forms a barrier between production areas in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, and the demand region in sort of these northeast states. What projects there have been able to be completed have been mostly along existing infrastructure, adding compressor stations, looping pipeline, sometimes doing under river crossings to kind of allow for that additional reliability. But the huge amount of development that we've been seeing has been kind of this northeast gas pushing west to displace Canadian gas coming in from the Rockies, and then from the Rockies further south as well as mid-continent gas. Diving into current infrastructure, sort of that you may have heard of this year, or that's kind of coming up in the next few years. I wanted to start with one of my favorite projects, Constitution. Constitution was a very early player in the build-out game in the Northeast. It was originally targeting to come into service around 2016 when the production was still incredibly constrained. It was going to take gas from this Northeast Pennsylvania dry basin up to Iroquois Pipeline, where it could have gone into Canada, and it could have gone kind of right over here into Massachusetts. Unfortunately, Constitution also became a flagship project for running into issues with the state of New York, which denied them the water quality permit that they needed in order to do any sort of stream crossing or ground disturbing activities in the state. That was a regulatory war fought somewhat bitterly and ultimately lost to the will of New York in blocking this pipeline. And Williams finally kind of called it quits in early 2020. It was canceled essentially due to rising costs. It was clear that they had exhausted almost every legal pathway. It was just going to be more money poured into a project that wasn't going to be finished. So they did finally cancel it. But the good news for both Cabot and Southwestern is that in the time that Constitution was fighting this extended regulatory battle, Transco was actually able to build an entire new pipeline here within Pennsylvania and allow these same two shippers pathway down to that Atlantic seaboard, which allowed them to recover some of their gas costs, but did leave customers in the northeastern area kind of stranded. In kind of a separate story, we have Northern Access 2016, which from the name of it was also trying to come into service for 2016, now targeting February 2022. This project has been through the ringer as well. It hasn't quite been in the lead or in the news as much as Constitution. They are, unlike Constitution, which is a greenfield pipeline, Northern Access follows existing pipeline in the National Fuel Gas Empire systems. It does add a couple of compressor stations in New York. These were originally natural gas fired, now they are electric. And it does look like this project will come into service, but we still see it at a pretty high risk because they still don't have every permit nailed down. And when this comes online, it will allow takeaway from sort of both this northeast Pennsylvania Marcellus area as well as sort of this southwest Pennsylvania Marcellus area to kind of route up here and into Canada. Very close to what the now operating Empire North project has done. Empire North also added compression in Pennsylvania and in New York to enhance sort of this part of the Empire pipeline. And I wanted to include that as a project that was able to kind of overcome these permit restrictions in New York. It's not impossible to get a project done in that state. It's just incredibly difficult. And if you look at sort of the capacity here, you can see it's very much an enhancement of existing and not sort of a new build style of project. Two other troubled projects in Pennsylvania. We have I'll kind of start off here with the Northeast Supply Enhancement Project. This was also canceled, much like Constitution, in early 2020 due to permit issues. Although this time the permit issues were both on the part of New York, which had sort of jurisdiction over this very ending path here, and the state of New Jersey, which moved pretty decisively to block it in the state. So the Northeast Supply Enhancement was canceled. It was going to allow additional flexibility for National Grid and to relieve some of the constraints that we see in peak winter demand region, or the peak winter demand season, where gas kind of has a difficult time getting onto Long Island for power generation. So this is kind of what causes prices to spike, is because we don't quite have enough pipeline capacity in this area to really take care of all of the demand, so it starts to compete against each other, and that drives prices up. For PennEast, instead of sort of canceling the project or continuing to kind of languish in courts to get the full project permitted, they've been running into issues in New Jersey, especially around eminent domain, getting their water permit. And this section of pipe has proven to be kind of the sticking point. And so what PennEast did is they went back to the drawing board and they said, we can build this pipeline in 2 phases. We have phase 1, which is the Pennsylvania portion, that essentially has all of its permits ready to go, and it will deliver gas to Columbia Gas into a new interstate pipeline called the Delphia Gateway that does kind of get some gas down into New Jersey. And then we have phase 2 at somewhat, hopefully by 2023. The timing here is a little more uncertain because it does depend on that New Jersey permit. But that phase 2 will then pick up gas where that phase 1 stops and transport it the rest of the way. And that will notably allow more of this Northeast Pennsylvania gas access to Algonquin, which can pick it up and take it to this captive Northeast market. So that's kind of on the Marcellus side. But on the Utica side, we've seen some infrastructure developments this year as well. Starting with the huge news of the cancellation of Atlantic Coast. This was canceled in mid-2020 on July 5th. Basically after years of legal fights that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, they did come out kind of the winner in that Supreme Court case, but it really cost the project quite a lot of money to delay that long, to fight in those courts, through all the courts. They still had quite a lot of legal battles ahead of them, even with that decision in hand. And ultimately, Duke and Dominion chose not to pursue the rest of the project. And this was kind of a big blow because this is a huge span of new infrastructure that would have supplied customers in sort of coastal Virginia as well as North Carolina. And these customers were kind of left stranded from Atlantic coast. But kind of paired with the cancellation and bad news on Atlantic coast, Mountain Valley has been also struggling with permits, struggling with the biological opinion, setbacks on the regulatory side, but Mountain Valley is still moving forward. And in fact, it has been 100% contracted this whole time, but EQT noted in their recent earnings call that they were actually looking to let some of their capacity go and take sort of this huge amount of capacity that they hold and perhaps sell it to some of these stranded Atlantic coast customers, which is a very good sign for Mountain Valley use and getting those volumes flowing. And even if we do see Mountain Valley kind of split into phases, which it's possible that we may see, we may also not see it split into phases. It may come online all at once. And that's really the difference here. That's where that green interconnect comes in at this sort of transition between phase 1 and phase 2. Right here at this sort of West Virginia line with Columbia Gas. And we do think that Mountain Valley still stands a chance of coming online in Q1 2021 in March, although that's a pretty high risk because we think that they have 4 to 5 months of construction left, especially since they'll be doing construction in steep terrain during the winter, which comes with quite a set of hazards. And if it's a nasty winter with lots of snow and blizzards, then that could set the project back even further. And they're still waiting to get a couple of their water permits from the Army Corps of Engineers, and they additionally need a permit from the Forest Service to cross a section of pipe or a section of land in Virginia. But we do think that they will get those before the end of the year. And then the big question is how winter construction proceeds. So that kind of wraps up where we are at the moment and what we're looking at for sort of these projects, the major projects in the Marcellus and Utica. We've seen really a mixed bag this year. We've seen some successful project completions. We've seen quite a few projects pushed even further out into the future. The 2016 project, we're looking at 2022 potentially. And we've seen the two major outlet for the Utica area, ACP and MVP. ACP was stalled for years and then canceled, and MVP has been stalled for years and then potentially coming online soon. But it's still kind of a risky maneuver. However, because of prevailing market forces, this delayed infrastructure, while not particularly great for production forecasts, is not really affecting it too much at the moment. The production forecast is being heavily influenced by forward prices, which haven't been particularly amazing in terms of driving growth. And as you can see here, we've had a consistent trajectory of growth upwards in the Appalachia core states of West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio since 2015, really since 2010. If I started at 2010, this first line is like down here in the 1 BCF range, and it just kind of grows here. But you can see as it kind of comes up and starts to hit this 2019, and then in dark blue you can see this 2020 line, and then in 2021 it's essentially flat. And that has to do a lot with sort of this guidance from the exploration and production companies where they're looking to maximize cash flow and show continuing value of their company rather than their ability to grow. They've proved the reserves out pretty well. We all know that there's a lot of gas in this area, and it's really down to sort of those market forces and the prices that are driving our forecasts. To dive into this a little bit more, to separate out the Marcellus, which is the larger producing region. This is sort of the West Virginia area as well as Pennsylvania. We saw this gas peak in 2020, really just last month. It was there at just under 27 BCF a day. And that is really kind of a holdover from gas that was shut in earlier this year when demand was pretty low, coming back online. Just before we started to see it kind of come back down for the maintenance season prior to winter. And it was filling our storage as well. So going into this winter, our storage capacity is very full, and production is not necessarily being called upon in the forward models right now or in the forward prices to provide a lot of winter gas, because we have so much in storage that's pretty cheap. So we do think this will kind of flatline and then stay pretty steady through the next year. This same story needs processing. There is quite a lot of dry gas in the area as well, but it was really hit by maintenance constraints here in sort of early 2020, held flat through the summer, and then it's recovering a little bit towards the end of 2020 and into early 2021, especially during winter, where gas has a pretty large local market that it can supply, even with that high storage level, but then it declines a little bit through 2021. So we're not really constrained by infrastructure here, because we have seen higher peaks, although we start 2021 pretty close to our peak from 2019. And that's really comes back to sort of our overall production forecast. The story here to remember is that right now we're seeing these outside market forces constrain the production here and not necessarily the infrastructure. But the infrastructure build out will continue for the next couple of years as we see sort of these last projects come online. And then really looking forward into the next part of the 2020s, where we are kind of starting with this flat production and looking forward, we can see opportunity to optimize the system, to create sort of these regional projects that allow the region to better supply its own needs, and to get ready for when there is the opportunity for this production growth that we saw between 2014 and 2019. And this is a slide really for your reference later on. This is sort of some identification of local projects. I've highlighted our major ones here. We've got Mountain Valley Pipeline and Penn East Phase 1. And this is really just looking at sort of this quarter of 2020 and then through into 2021. And as you get further out, the timing becomes a little bit more questionable. We start to see some of these projects still in earlier phases of FERC regulatory issues. The environmental assessment, environmental impact statements have been issued, but maybe not certificates. Or we have these projects that have certificates, but haven't yet begun construction. So these are ones to keep an eye on, whereas these under late construction, we're feeling pretty confident about their ability to come online. Looking forward, again, pipelines in the Northeast have reached kind of a threshold where they now carry quite a lot of additional discussion. The milestones for them are a little bit harder to achieve. The journey through the regulatory process is much, much longer. both because of the increasingly complicated nature of the regulatory process, as well as the constant presence of legal challenges. And that has really shaped the pipeline industry in the last 5 to 10 years. We've seen additional delays crop up at FERC, at the Army Corps of Engineers. We've had some trouble this year with their nationwide 12 permit. States like New York have stepped in to kind of bring state level politics into it. And then in addition to that, we've seen coordinated opposition in response to pipelines on the behalf of quite a few different folks. You see Sierra Club in there all the time. The Delaware River Keeper's another big one for the Northeast. And these are there to kind of keep the pipelines accountable, make sure that they are choosing the best path that makes sense for everyone involved, and to, in some cases, tie up these projects in court cases. And so it's something to keep an eye on. I do think that we have seen the last of the major pipelines. MVP may be the last sort of major interstate pipeline that we see built for the next 10 years. I don't think that's a wild statement to make, if just because now we are looking at pipelines taking, somewhere between 5 to 7 years to move from sort of that open season into construction. And then even in Atlantic Coast's case, sometimes that construction doesn't finish. So once we have a defined market need to build more pipelines, I don't think it's completely off the table, but I do think that it'll be difficult to get any of them built before 2030. And that is a view also suggested by our long-range models on the Wood Mackenzie side. And with that, it's not a particularly upbeat note, but I'd like to kind of move into the question and answer session, and I'll hand it back to Joe to coordinate that.
Do we have any questions of Collette?
I can't hear you very well. Could you step closer to the microphone?
Yeah, do we have any questions of Collette?
Oh, perfect.
Collette, I have one.
Okay.
I know you deal with pipelines. Have you or Wood Mackenzie done any work looking at natural gas consumption here in the Appalachian Basin when the Shell cracker plant goes online? And the latest rumors are, possibly sometime in 2021. So could you comment on that?
Oh, I don't know our exact estimated construction timeline for the Shell cracker. I do know that it is incorporated as a demand source into our long-range model. However, the model works on sort of an extended time scale. So, it could be 2021 or 2022. Most of what I've been looking at for increased demand has been in like the late 2020s. There is sort of a continuing growth in the region, but as that cracker comes online, it may displace, say, some of the power consumption and the power demand, the residential demand. So it'll edge those current demand sources out and kind of take their place. So it'll be a give and take, but ultimately additive. And we do think it does come online. I'm just not certain on the exact timing.